Hey guys, it's Eric here, and as I mentioned in the previous video, I'm going to talk about the different editions of Mutant up until Mutant Year Zero and the upcoming game Mutant Year Zero Road to Eden. I'm starting out good today, aren't I? Well, back in the 1980s, there was, let's put it like this. Back in the 80s, there wasn't much of a competition. There were no role-playing games in my country at all. They didn't exist. Like the end of the 70s, when Gygax and the guys over in the US had created Dungeons and Dragons and got millions of fans and everything, and it started to spread across the world, we still didn't have anything over here. We had board games. That's basically it. But there were some smart guys I've mentioned in the previous video that they went together and they created their own gaming company called Äventyrsspel Target Games, basing most of their game line on the basic role-playing system. And they started out with a flagship product, which I have talked about several times, called Drakar och Demoner, which is Dragons and Demons, which isn't the same as Dungeons and Dragons, but is kind of the Swedish answer or the Scandinavian answer to Dungeons and Dragons. 1982 it was released and it garnered a lot of players. And by 1984 the company wanted to expand and they actually put in an order for a game set after the Catastrophe. Back in the 80s, it was still, you know, the Cold War between the Soviets and the US, and the rest of the world was on the brink of destruction every single day, which meant that you had not the rosiest view of the future. Gamma World was quite big in the US, I think, at least. I'm not 100% sure there. But basically, what they did was they wanted to create their own version of Gamma World. Gamma World is set in the US, so they wanted to make Gamma World, but in Scandinavia. And they did. So in 1984 they released a game called Mutant. Now, Mutant is set, of course, I mean, since it's a Swedish company, they set it in Sweden, which is understandable. I can understand that, and I respect that. I mean, you want to get people to feel more part of the plot, and I would say that this game, it was a good start. It had a lot of balancing issues. I would say it was still lacking. Like most of the games back then when they came out, first edition usually has a bit of a problem because it's not today though, but back then it was quite common that you basically just got the rules and a little bit of information on the world itself. There wasn't that much world building. This was supplemented because in 1983 they started their own magazine. Like many gaming companies did. I mean, Games Workshop had its own version, which is White Dwarf. Dungeons and Dragons had their own, I think it's called Dragons. Is it still called Dragon to this day? I don't know. And also, by the way, those who are interested in playing Gamma World, please let me know how the similarities look between this game and the original Gamma World. Any similarities? I find it kind of interesting. So they released supplementary information in their own magazine, which is called Sinkadus. Well, it was called Sinkadus, it is defunct now. And I find that really hilarious that they chose the name Sinkadus because it means to get a bitch slap. Oh, moving on. So, Mutant released in 1984. That was the first edition of the game. And it took place in Scandinavia, more exactly in a kingdom called Pyri Samfundet, which is basically like the middle part of Sweden. It's an empire, ruled by an emperor. It has been around, I think it's the basically it's been around for a little bit over 100 years. That's more or less it. It's ruled by the emperor, Thorulf Skarprättare, which means Thorolf the Executioner, of the Executioner line or dynasty. The ruling class of the empire is and has always been the non-mutated humans. that makes it quite interesting. They are a very extreme minority. Most other creatures are mutated humans, mutated animals, robots. My pronunciation is not good today. Robots. There are psionically gifted humans and psionically gifted animals in this world. What happened? The background, the plot basically is that the grand catastrophe has happened. It has been there, it has passed, and now is the recolonization time. And they were a little bit more forward with the plot here, because in the world book, it actually claims that, I don't think it was in the first edition though, but it claims that a space probe went to Mars and got some soil samples, which were brought back to Earth, and they contained an incurable disease, the Grey Death, I think they call it, that caused an epidemic around the world, which resulted, of course, in most of the human race dying out. The other part of the human race that survived isolated themselves into giant underground bunkers called enclaves, and isolated themselves entirely from the world. Oh, sorry. You might recognize this if you play Mutant Year Zero, especially if you have played Year Zero, and especially, what's it called? GenLab Alpha? Genetic Lab Alpha? Because humanity started to experiment on animals and humans to change their genetic code to be able to live on the surface, so they could still get the good stuff above. After a while, or however long it was, there started to grow a population above ground. And the enclave started to, open up a little bit, talk to each other more, which resulted, of course, in them not getting along. This ended in a full-scale nuclear war. And that means that, except for the fact that you had an epidemic that is still around in this world, you also have biological weaponry, chemical weaponry, and atomic weaponry being used. And those areas that are still infected with this problem are called simply the Forbidden Zones. All the previous civilizations basically disappeared, and people started to crawl out of the enclaves and started to resettle the world. And I can't remember exactly. I think it's the 26th century, maybe 27th, that this game takes place. The game had 3 editions. There was the first edition, which is the one I'm probably showing now above my shoulder. I don't remember which side it is on, but that one. They made a revised version of it a little bit later, and 2 years after that, they released the second edition. They also released, Dungeons & Dragons had the basic Dungeons & Dragons, and then they had advanced Dungeons & Dragons. They did something similar here. They did the same with Dragons and Demons, that they released a kind of advanced rules edition. They call it the Expert Rules. So they released the same for Mutant, which they called Mutant II. With more information about the world, they also added a few new classes like cyborgs, cryonically frozen humans, and oddly enough, robotic humans. That is a human who has removed the brain and put it into a robot body. There were some really, really weird other fan-made races too that were added to this game. Then there were some really, really freaking cool ones like the Rubbits, and I think people have heard about them. They are vegan rabbits who hate all other races. They want to kill all other races because they eat meat. Militaristic and crazy insane. They are basically a terrorist cell with ADHD, and they love high technology. High technology became within the Pyrisamfundet, it's the main, it's what everybody wants to find. It had a lot of fun references, like old references to other things within Swedish society or society in general, really funny names. It was kind of cutesy in a way. The technology was about late 17th century, 18th century. Late 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, with flintlock weapons or one-shot gunpowder weapons. Combine that with laser weaponry that can be found. It gets really funny in that way. I remember also that the first adventure module that actually came with the main box was called Uppdrag I Mosul, which is like Mission to Mosul, or Mosul, where we got the weirdest and the freaking toughest end boss ever in the game, in this game series at least. I mean, there are even harder ones in the later game series, but basically it wasn't like the standard big bad evil guy. It was a big bad evil guy in a way, but it's not like this guy that you meet, he laughs at you, twirls his mustache and then ditches off and everything. No, it was an intelligent fucking tree. You heard me. It was an intelligent tree that was using its seed pods to create clones of the people in the city to like kidnap, body snatch them. The slave creatures that it created took a human, it made a copy, then it ate the regular human. And that's how it did it. And as I remember, it was a freaking hard boss. I mean, it's a tree. It shouldn't be hard, but it was. It was really hard because it had its slave monsters with it. And all that. There was another mission which is available in Mutant Year Zero. Because what they did, they opened up like you can play within any time period that takes place within the mutant universe. Most people play between the year 108 to 111, more or less, which is like the main setting time. But there was one called In the Clutches of the Reptile Men, I Reptilmännens klor, which took place like almost 100 years before that. Which makes it quite interesting in its own way. There was one called, most of them took place, of course, in the present, present within the setting. There was also another adventure supplement called Ringin, which is kind of a fun play on word. It means järn, the spelling J-A with two dots, A-R-N, means iron. But if you add an edge in the beginning of that word, it becomes brain. So it's like the brain ring, the iron ring. It's basically an organization of psionically gifted humans who are trying to conquer the Pyrisamfundet and take the power. And you have to stop them. That's kind of a cool story when you think about it. There was also the Grey Death series, which was 2 adventure games. Well, adventure games, what I'm saying. Adventure modules. The first one called Necropolis. The Pyrisamfundet wasn't the only state that actually re-arose from the ashes of the apocalypse. In Denmark, a new state was created, a militaristic dictatorship called the Wolf Kingdom, Ulvriket, run by a military. Well, it's a military dictatorship. It's run by several generals and a super commandant or whatever. And their main capital is called the Necropolis. And that was the name of this adventure module too. The country had started to basically expand its kingdom into the Swedish territories, which is Skåne, and is still not conquered by Pyrisamfundet, but it's called the Plains of Freedom, which is basically a huge Mad Max area. I love that area. It's so weird and wonky and funny in a way. It was followed up by Brisbrygga, which brings an end to the entire storyline. It's a big storyline in itself. And I remember playing it, but I don't remember much of it myself. And after Brigga, they actually released then Mutant II, which was the more advanced, more skills were released, more information about the environment, the setting, more information about settings. There were information about, I actually have it here on screen, so just a moment. There were some short information about Scandinavia, Finland, different kingdoms in Norway, northwest Russia, the Baltics, Poland, Germany. What happened to those countries? There were even the Ellis people were found, which are basically like the British now living on the waters under Elizabeth IV. There were Scottish badgers. They are called the Albion Badgers. They are really funny and very, very angry too. So that was a really fun expansion on the game in itself. Then they started to release like the follow-up adventures. One was a regular module called, like an expansion called After Ragnarok. Everybody knows what Ragnarok is. It's the end of the Viking world, like the apocalypse, basically. I mean, Scandinavians, we have to use the word Ragnarok. It brings in new classes, new mutations, more information about the Pyri Samfundet, about Gotland and Jämtland, which are kingdoms within the Swedish territories. More information about Hindenburg, which is the main capital of Pyri Samfundet. Well, some more monsters and stuff, funny things like that. I'll see here if I have that here. There's even mentions of the Eden 2 project, which... oh yeah, I had a quick look here. It's way more information about the Pyri Samfundet. It's a lot of fun stuff that they actually flesh out the world with. There's information about some things that maybe people like me or maybe some other nerds might recognize, like Café Arbeiter, Spetsnaz, like Spetsnaz, but it's a club. The bunker. There's also the start of a very interesting thing that they discuss, which is racism, which I think I mentioned before. There's a big class war between pure humans and mutated animals, different freedom fighting groups between them. So speciesism, not racism. And I find that very interesting. There's also... after this came Hotspot Hindenburg, which I can't remember a bloody thing about right now. It's an adventure where you travel to the northern part, outside of the kingdom. And I just checked it out, and I've already forgotten what the hell it was about. It's something... Oh, right, it's about a terror organization called the Children of the Streets that have kidnapped the Emperor's advisor. That's it. But the entire cycle has a really good finale with the Guardians of the Catastrophe. The Guardians of the Catastrophe, I feel, was actually a good end of the entire cycle of the regular mutants, of the official modules that they released. I don't know. I haven't checked out the companion magazine more on this point. But the Guardians of the Catastrophe is basically you have to stop a crazed group from entering an old enclave and setting off a nuclear warhead and destroying Hindenburg and destroying the Empire. That's actually a good finale that's a good final module to release in the series of this cycle. As I said, it has a lot of fun, interesting things. It took a lot of time for them to get from one point to the other. It took them a couple of years, but they built a very good, steady setting. Gave you the opportunity to play it at different time ages. You can actually play in the time of year 0, basically. all the way up to a point where it's up to a point where you are basically at steam power. After that, that wouldn't be mutant anymore, it would be something else. But of course they open up to the possibility that you can use the rules and continue moving on with your plot if you want to have even higher technology. It's a little bit like GURPS in that way. Like GURPS Lite, when you have the technology levels, you can actually choose which way you want to play in your setting. So you could, theoretically speaking, move it on. As I said, it's really fun. It's a little bit cutesy in a way. But still, if you like a game with a bit of a sense of humor, that it doesn't take itself too seriously, this is a good one. It still has, well, like all games, especially the older games, it has its balance issues, some really weird and wonky things, but that's what house ruling is for. And a good GM can actually go through that and with their players actually make corrections to mollify or at least substitute such weirdness that might appear within the setting. Up next, we're going to talk about New Mutant, which is the one that came out in 1989, where they went from this cutesy, really nice, interesting world of Scandinavia, where they went full cyberpunk and weapons fetishism. But I will talk about that in the next episode. So thank you guys so much for watching, and if you liked what you saw, do leave a like and a comment. But for now, I'm going to sign off, and I'll see you guys later.